was always skeptical of ghost stories. Who wouldn't be? They're just tales, passed down, exaggerated, meant to spook or entertain. But I wasn't prepared for what happened to me last fall. A single call changed everything I thought I knew about the line between life and death. It started as any ordinary evening. The kind of evening you don't think twice about. I had no idea it would end with me questioning reality itself. Picture this. You're alone in your home. The streets outside are silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Then it happens. A call comes through. Your phone lights up with a number you don't recognize. Normally you'd ignore it, but this time, something compels you to pick it up. You press the screen, and there's no one there, just static. At first, it's faint, harmless even. But then you hear it. Faint breathing, soft at first, then sharper. A voice, a name, your name. That's how it started for me. One call. At 3:07 a.m. Who was calling? Why did I answer? I wish I could say I didn't. I wish I could say I had ignored the vibration, that I had shut it off, thrown the phone away. But I didn't, and I've been haunted ever since. It wasn't just me. That's the part I need you to understand. I thought it was at first. Thought I was the only one who'd experienced something so unexplainable. But as I looked deeper, the truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't an isolated event. It was happening to people as well. Some dismissed it as harmless, a technical glitch, an artifact of our hyper-connected age. Others thought it was a cruel prank, the kind that only someone with a warped sense of humor could dream up. But for those of us who've received these calls, we know. We know there's something much stranger happening. It's not just the calls themselves, it's what comes after. Lives are changed, sometimes shattered. Some people claim they were warned, even saved, by voices they hadn't heard in years. Others say the voices demanded something they couldn't ignore. And some, they vanish. Gone without a trace, after a final call from a number no one can trace. Think about it for a moment. Imagine hearing the ringtone in the dead of night, seeing a familiar name on the screen. A name you know shouldn't be there. A name belonging to someone who's gone. Would you answer? Could you? What if the voice on the other end wasn't just random static? What if it knew things? Knew you? Knew secrets you've never told anyone? And what if that voice wasn't alone? Some people might shrug it off, say it's just the brain playing tricks. But how do you explain when the phone number belongs to someone who's been dead for years? How do you explain when the voice tells you things no living person could possibly know? This is where it started for me. One night, one call. It wasn't just a message from beyond. It was the beginning of something I was never prepared for. I don't expect you to believe me. I'm not even sure I'd believe myself if I were hearing this for the first time. But this is my story. It's the true account of the night I answered a call that wasn't meant for the living. And once I did, there was no turning back. You might be wondering, is this some kind of elaborate hoax, a coincidence, or is it proof that the dead are closer than we think? Tonight, I'll show you everything I uncovered. The evidence, the experiences, and the chilling aftermath. So I'll ask you again, if someone you lost called you, would you answer? And more importantly, what would you say if you knew it was your last chance to speak to them? Keep watching, because this story isn't just about me, it's about you, it's about all of us. And by the end, you might find yourself questioning the next time your phone rings in the middle of the night. It had been 3 weeks since my father passed. 3 long, gray weeks that felt like they stretched on forever. If you've ever lost someone, you know what I mean. Time becomes strange. The days blur together, and the nights are even worse. Silent, oppressive, endless. That night, the rain had been falling for hours. I remember the steady rhythm against the windows, each drop hitting like a faint echo of my own thoughts. The house was dark except for a single lamp in the living room, casting a dim glow over the clutter I hadn't been able to clean up. His things were still everywhere. His favorite blanket draped over the couch, his glasses sitting on the side table next to the book he never got to finish. I wasn't doing anything in particular, just sitting there, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, looking for something to distract me, something to pull me out of that heavy fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was too quiet. You know how sometimes silence doesn't feel peaceful, it feels wrong? That's how it was that night. And then the static started. At first I thought it was the TV, but it wasn't on. Then I thought maybe it was the rain hitting the windows, but no, this was different. It was faint, almost like a whisper, creeping in at the edges of the room. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. The lamp flickered once, just enough to catch my attention. I told myself it was just the storm messing with the power, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. I glanced at my phone again, and that's when it happened. The screen lit up, the vibration breaking through the stillness. At first, I didn't look closely. I figured it was just another spam call or a late-night text from some random app. But then I saw the name. It was his name. My dad's name. My heart stopped. For a second, I thought maybe it was a cruel joke. Someone using his old phone number to mess with me. But no, that didn't make sense. I'd canceled his plan after the funeral. His number wasn't active anymore. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The phone kept vibrating, the sound suddenly louder than the rain, louder than the static, louder than my own thoughts. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Should I answer? Every rational part of me said no. This wasn't possible. It wasn't him. But my hand moved on its own. Before I knew it, my thumb was hovering over the green button. I hesitated. My throat was dry, my breathing shallow. The call was still coming through, and for the briefest moment, I thought I could hear something faint, just beneath the vibration. A voice. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at that glowing screen. Finally, I gave in. My thumb pressed the button, and the call connected. Hello? The word barely escaped my lips. My voice cracked, shaky, like I was afraid to hear whatever might be on the other end. There was nothing. No response, no sound, just silence. And then the breathing started. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But it got louder, clearer, short, shallow breaths, like someone was struggling to get the words out. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Who is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the static. And then the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my hand trembling. The call log showed his name, his number, as clear as day. But when I tried to call it back, I got the automated message. This number is no longer in service. My stomach sank. I told myself it was a glitch, a mistake. Maybe the number had been reassigned to someone else, and they accidentally called me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I sat there in the dark, the rain still falling outside, the lamp flickering again. I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore. I wouldn't tell anyone. I'd forget it ever happened. But then the phone vibrated again, and this time the voicemail icon appeared. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the breathing again. That faint, shallow sound, as if whoever or whatever was on the other end had been right there in the room with me. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, but the silence that followed was worse. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some weird coincidence. Maybe my phone glitched, or maybe someone had hacked it. People do strange things for attention, right? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. And then the calls started again. The first one came the next night. This time, it was around midnight. I'd left the phone face down on the table, trying not to think about it, but when it started vibrating, I froze. Slowly, I reached for it, turning it over, and there it was again. His name, my father's name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I watched as the screen lit up, vibrating steadily until it finally stopped. But the moment it went quiet, the voicemail icon appeared. I didn't listen to it. Not at first. I just sat there, staring at the screen, my stomach in knots. A part of me didn't want to know what it said. Another part of me needed to know. When I finally pressed play, the static was the first thing I heard. Louder this time, harsher, like it was clawing its way through the speaker. And then his voice came through. Why did you let me die? I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the voicemail still playing, his voice repeating the same question over and over. I wanted to believe it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the voice, it was his. There was no mistaking it. The next call came the following night. This time I didn't even pick up the phone. I just watched as it vibrated on the table, the screen flashing his name over and over. When the call ended, another voicemail appeared. I hesitated for what felt like hours before I finally pressed play. "I need you to help me." His voice was clearer this time, the static less intense. But the tone, it wasn't the voice I remembered. It was strained, almost desperate, as if he was struggling to say the words. And that's when I noticed something else. The lights in the room flickered, just like they had the night before. I glanced around, my heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw something. A shadow. Not my own, but something darker, shifting in the corner of the room. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. I hadn't slept in days after all. But when the shadow moved again, I knew it wasn't just in my head. By the third night, the calls were coming more frequently. Once, twice, 3 times in the span of an hour. Each time I let them go to voicemail, and each time the messages got worse. "Why won't you answer? You owe me. Come find me." I stopped sleeping entirely. The house felt wrong. Every noise, every flicker of light, every shifting shadow put me on edge. I kept the phone with me at all times, not because I wanted to, but because I was terrified of missing something. During the day, I tried to find answers. I searched the internet, desperate to figure out what was happening to me. At first, all I found were articles about grief and coping mechanisms, none of which explained the calls. But then I stumbled across something else. It was a forum, a small, hidden corner of the internet where people shared stories about receiving calls from the dead. Most of the posts seemed like fiction, like the kind of thing people write to scare each other. But some felt too real to ignore. One post, in particular, caught my attention. It was from someone who claimed they'd been getting calls from their brother for weeks. The pattern was eerily similar: static, voicemails, strange shadows. But what struck me the most was the way their story ended. The last message they received wasn't a voicemail. It was a text. 2 words, "I'm here." That was the last anyone heard from them. According to the post, they vanished without a trace, their phone found abandoned in their empty apartment. My hands were shaking as I read it. It couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax. But deep down, I knew better. And then, as if on cue, my phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a voicemail. I hadn't even heard the phone ring. I stared at the screen, the little notification icon taunting me. I knew I should listen to it, but my chest tightened at the thought of hearing his voice again. I put the phone down and backed away, my eyes locked on the screen. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer. The static wasn't just in the phone anymore, it was in the air around me, faint but unmistakable. I told myself I'd listen later. I needed time to think, to prepare myself for whatever I might hear. But the truth was, I was too scared to press play. And that voicemail, it's still there, waiting for me. I don't know why I kept the phone. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something else. Something I didn't want to admit to myself. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to turn it off, throw it away, or even leave it in another room. It became an obsession. Every time it lit up, my heart raced, and yet I couldn't look away. The voicemail icon remained unplayed, a small, glowing reminder of something I didn't understand. Finally, after days of torment, I decided I couldn't avoid it anymore. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop on its own. I sat down, the phone in my trembling hand, and pressed play. The static was back, louder and more chaotic than before. It buzzed and hissed, filling the room as if the sound itself was alive. But then, cutting through the noise, I heard his voice again. "You have to come to where I am. It's not safe here." My blood ran cold. I replayed the message, hoping I'd misheard it, but the words didn't change. It was his voice, clear and desperate, pleading with me to do something I didn't understand. Where was he? What did he mean? It's not safe here. The questions swirled in my mind, but before I could make sense of them, something else happened. The house shifted. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt as if the air itself had changed. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, and the temperature dropped suddenly, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the room. And then came the noise. It started as a faint tapping, barely audible, coming from somewhere upstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling, old wood creaking in the cold, but the sound grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body screaming for me to move, to run, to do something. but I couldn't. I just stared at the ceiling, listening as the footsteps moved slowly, deliberately from one end of the house to the other. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I held my breath, waiting for whatever came next, and then the phone rang. This time, the sound was deafening. The vibration rattled the table, the screen glowing so brightly it lit up the entire room. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I knew it was him. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the phone and threw it as hard as I could against the wall. The impact was loud, the screen shattering into pieces. For a moment, I felt relief. But then it rang again. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping as I saw it. The phone was back on the table, completely intact, glowing with an incoming call. I backed away, shaking my head. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the ringing didn't stop. And then the voice came again, cutting through the chaos. "This is your last chance to answer. Don't keep me waiting." My heart felt like it was going to explode. I had no idea what was happening or why, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the phone, my hands trembling, and pressed the button to answer. "Where are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. His voice came through, clearer than ever. "You have to come to me. You know where." And then the line went dead. Those last words echoed in my mind. "You know where." At first, I didn't understand, but then it hit me. There was only one place he could mean, the cemetery. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay where I was, to lock the doors and pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until I did what he asked. The drive to the cemetery was surreal. The roads were empty, the streetlights flickering as if the entire world was holding its breath. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. When I arrived, the gates were already open, creaking softly in the wind. I stepped out of the car, my flashlight cutting through the thick fog that blanketed the ground. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something guided me. It wasn't the kind of guidance you can explain. There was no logic to it. I just knew where to go. I followed the path, the gravel crunching under my feet, until I reached his grave. The headstone stood there, cold and silent, just as I'd left it 3 weeks ago. And then the phone rang again. I pulled it out of my pocket, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The screen lit up, and for the first time, there was no name, just a single word, "Here." I answered. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely audible. The static came first, loud and overwhelming, but then his voice broke through. "It's not safe here," he said again, his tone urgent, almost panicked. I looked around, but there was no one else, just the fog, the graves, and the suffocating silence. "Where are you?" I asked again, my voice cracking. There was a pause, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Behind you." I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but what I saw wasn't him. It wasn't anyone. It was something else. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear, his voice echoing in my head, "Behind you." I didn't want to turn around. Every part of me screamed not to. My legs locked in place, my breath shallow and uneven. But something else, a pull, a compulsion I couldn't explain, forced me to move. Slowly I turned, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it cut through the thick fog. And then I saw it. There, at the far edge of the cemetery, was an old phone booth. The kind you don't see anymore. The glass was cracked, and the metal frame was rusted and weathered, as though it had been abandoned for decades. But the strangest thing? The light inside was on. I didn't move at first, didn't even breathe. The booth felt wrong, out of place, like it didn't belong in this world. And then the ringing started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder, sharper, until it was impossible to ignore. The sound pulled me forward, step by shaky step, until I was standing just a few feet away. I could see the phone now, an old rotary model, its black surface gleaming under the flickering light. It sat on its cradle, vibrating with each shrill ring. "Don't answer," a voice whispered in my head. My own voice, desperate and pleading, but my hand didn't listen. I stepped into the booth, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The air inside was heavy, stifling, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the receiver, and then I picked it up. The ringing stopped instantly, replaced by silence so thick it felt like the world had been muted. For a moment I thought no one was there, but then the static came. It was faint at first, like a distant radio station struggling to tune in, but it grew louder, more insistent, until a voice finally broke through. "Now we can be together," he said. My heart sank. It was his voice, but it wasn't right. There was something off about it, something hollow, as if the words were being spoken through him but not by him. And then everything changed. The light in the booth flickered violently, and the fog outside thickened, swirling around the glass like a living thing. The ground beneath me shifted, the solid earth giving way to something softer, looser. I looked down and saw that the grass was gone, replaced by dark, wet soil. And then I noticed them. Hands, pale, skeletal hands pushing up from the ground, clawing their way into the air. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the glass as the hands multiplied, dozens of them, all reaching, grasping, pulling themselves free. One by one they emerged, figures draped in shadow, their faces obscured but their movements deliberate. They surrounded the booth, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. But no sound came out, only the static, louder and more chaotic than ever. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The phone crackled in response, and his voice came again, clearer this time. "You don't understand. I'm not alone." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" I whispered. There was a pause, and then he said it. "We're all waiting for you here." The figures outside pressed against the glass now, their skeletal fingers scraping at the surface. The walls of the booth groaned under the pressure, the cracks in the glass spreading like spider webs. I dropped the phone, my hands fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The booth was shaking now, the light flickering wildly, the static deafening. And then the phone rang again. This time, the sound was different. Deeper, deeper, angrier. The receiver dangled from the cord, swaying back and forth, the shrill tone cutting through the chaos. I didn't want to answer it. I couldn't. But as the figures outside began to press harder, their hollow eyes staring into mine, I knew I didn't have a choice. I reached for the receiver, my hands trembling, and brought it to my ear. "Please," I whispered. "Tell me what's happening." His voice came again, soft and almost tender. "You should never have answered." And then everything went dark. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, the sound of breaking glass, the feeling of hands grabbing me, pulling me down, dragging me into the cold, wet earth. His voice, whispering in my ear over and over, "We're all waiting for you." And then silence. I woke up gasping for air, clawing at the dirt as if I had been buried alive. For a moment I couldn't tell where I was. My hands were trembling, my vision blurred, and my lungs burned like I'd been holding my breath for hours. When my eyes finally adjusted, I realized I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. I was home. Back in my living room, sitting on the floor in front of the couch. Everything looked the same. Same clutter, same lamp flickering in the corner. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the window. But something felt wrong. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, that makes the air feel heavier than it should. I reached for my phone, still in my hand, and checked the screen. The call log was empty. No missed calls, no voicemails, no evidence that anything had happened at all. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. Maybe it had all been some terrible nightmare. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing, but then I heard it. The faintest sound coming from somewhere in the room. A ringing. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There on the table was the phone. Not my phone. The phone from the booth. The old, black rotary phone, sitting there as if it had always been part of the room. It was ringing. The sound was sharp, mechanical, cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of how it had followed me here. The ringing grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that phone as I could. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, my body frozen in place, as if the phone was holding me there. I took a step forward, then another. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But I didn't. When I reached the table, the ringing stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down at the phone. The room was silent again, except for the faint static that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then it lit up. The rotary dial began to spin on its own, the numbers clicking softly as it turned. I watched, paralyzed, as it finished dialing, the static growing louder with each passing second. Finally, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away. My eyes locked on the phone as it sat there, vibrating on the table. The ringing grew louder and louder, echoing in my ears until it was the only sound I could hear. And then, it stopped. The room was still. The static had faded, the phone silent. But as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow standing in the doorway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I turned back to the phone, and my heart sank. It was ringing again. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped between the shadow and the phone. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like an eternity. Finally, I reached for the phone. My hand hovered over the receiver, shaking so badly I could barely keep it steady. And then, as my fingers brushed against the cold surface, the shadow moved. It stepped forward, its figure dark and featureless, and for the first time I heard its voice. Answer it. The words were faint, barely more than a whisper, but they sent a chill through my entire body. I looked back at the phone, the screen glowing, the vibration rattling the table. And then I heard another voice, my father's voice. "Please," he said, "pick up." I hesitated, my mind racing. Was it really him, or was it something else, something using his voice to lure me in? The shadow stepped closer, its presence suffocating, and the phone grew louder, more urgent. I didn't know what to do, and then everything went black. This is the story of the night I answered the call that never should have come. But what do you think? Was it really his voice reaching out from the other side, desperate to pull me closer to wherever he is now? Or was it something darker, something hiding behind the sound of his voice, waiting to draw me in? I still don't know what to believe. Maybe it was a connection to the beyond. Maybe I imagined it all, a descent into the chaos of grief. Or maybe it was something worse. But here's the thing, the phone is still ringing. I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you answer, knowing it might be your last call? Or would you walk away, leave the phone behind, and hope the ringing doesn't follow you? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading every story, every theory. And if this story gave you chills, if it made you question what might happen the next time your phone rings in the dead of night, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good scare, someone brave enough to listen all the way to the end. But don't think this is the last you'll hear from me. We'll uncover new stories daily. Subscribe and turn on notifications now, because you won't want to miss this one. Until then, keep your phones close, but be careful who you answer.